Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining the Second Chance Act Innovations and Supervision Initiative Grant Program Solicitation webinar. The purpose of this webinar is to share information about this grant program, provide an overview of main requirements, address the application and selection criteria process, offer resources, hear from a current grantee's application experience, and answer any questions you may have about the process. We will be referring to the Innovations and Supervision Initiative Grant Program as ISI. My name is Olivia Kukui. I am a policy analyst at the Council of State Governments Justice Center and will be presenting today along with Heather Tubman-Carbone, Senior Policy Advisor at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, U.S. Department of Justice. I would also like to welcome and give a big thanks to the New York City Department of Probation, a current fiscal year 15 ISI grantee. Dr. Nancy Andy Laurel, Director of Research, will speak later on in this webinar about the department's experience in applying for this grant program. Thank you all for joining the webinar and to BJA for partnering with us on this presentation. Before getting started, I'd like to briefly talk through a couple of housekeeping items about how the webinar is going to work. Anytime during this webinar, you can ask a question by typing in the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. This includes both technical and content-related questions. We will try to reply to technical questions in the chat window as we go. For the content-related questions, we will keep a running list and address them all at the end of the webinar. We will do our best to get through as many questions as possible. If you encounter technical or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. Please understand that there will be some technical issues we may not be able to resolve. For this reason, we are recording the content portion of this webinar and will post it on our website at csgjusticecenter.org/NRRC. We should have the webinar posted online early next week. Once it has been posted, we will email you the link of the recording. Today's webinar is organized into 5 parts. You will hear an introduction of the NRRC and BJA, followed by an overview of ISI. We will then discuss key components of the grant program requirements and application process, followed by a dialogue with a current grantee who has successfully completed the application process and will share their experience in planning process. And finally, we will close out with a Q&A session to address any questions you may have. Before we jump in, we would love to know who is on the line. Please take a moment to answer our poll question. You should see it there on the right-hand side of the portion. What type of organization are you representing? State, local, or federally organized Indian tribal government? You will have about 10 seconds to respond. Please choose one. We always love to see where our applicants are coming from, and you will see shortly that we have a wide range of applicants applying from all over the country. The poll will be closing shortly. Great. Thank you all for participating in our poll. There we go. Thank you. Let's jump right in here and give a quick overview of the Justice Center. The Justice Center is a national nonprofit organization that serves policymakers at the local, state, and federal level from all branches of the government. Staff provides practical, nonpartisan advice and evidence-based, conscience-driven strategies to increase public safety and strengthen communities. You can find our website at csgjusticecenter.org and can follow us on Twitter at CSGJC. In addition to serving policymakers, the Justice Center provides technical assistance to all Second Chance Act grantees through the National Reentry Resource Center, or NRRC, which is funded through the Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance. The NRRC was authorized by the passage of the Second Chance Act in April 2008 and launched by the Council of State Governments in October 2009. Through the partnership with the Bureau of Justice Assistance, we provide support to Second Chance Act grantees and the broader field in a way that advances and promotes the work being done in this field. We are constantly adding new content and resources to our website, and we send out monthly newsletters that provide information about the latest resources, funding opportunities, distant learning events, and other news about reentry. The NRRC website is a great resource for grantees and the field at large. You will find a directory of our latest projects, resources, facts, and trends, and items in the news. Each topic page provides links to recent research and publications and news clips about that subject. The NRRC regularly hosts webinars on a wide variety of topics related to reentry, and all webinars are recorded, archived, and available on our website. We encourage everyone who hasn't done so already to sign up for the newsletter by going to csgjusticecenter.org/subscribe. The newsletter highlights Second Chance grantees, provides information on new publications and resources, as well as update recipients on training, relevant news, and most appropriate for this webinar, the latest reentry funding opportunities. I will now turn it over to Heather of BJA to give an overview of the Bureau of Justice Assistance.
Thanks, Olivia, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Heather Tubman-Carbone with the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and I manage some of our corrections and community corrections portfolio, as well as the Justice Reinvestment Initiative. The grant program we're here to talk about today, Innovations in Supervision, is really the only one that targets supervision agencies and gives you what I would argue is sort of carte blanche to do whatever you need to do to help your agency achieve its goals. So let me give you some quick background on BJA and the funding source for this grant, and then we'll dig into specifics. The Bureau of Justice Assistance is an agency within the Office of Justice Programs at the Department of Justice. We sit at the intersection of policy and practice. Our mission, as you can see, is to provide leadership and services in grant administration and criminal justice policy development to support local, state, and tribal communities such as yourselves. And we do that in part by keeping a finger on the pulse of the field, what's happening, what's needed, what's working, and what's not. And importantly, what don't we know about? And we provide funding to jurisdictions across the country to address those challenges and to test new strategies to advance us all. Next slide, please. One of the types of funding we push out through grants comes from the Second Chance Act, signed by then President Bush in 2008 and reauthorized recently in 2018. The Second Chance Act has supported over $400 million in reentry investments to a variety of initiatives across the country through several grant programs. This one, Innovations in Supervision Initiative, or ISI, is one of those many programs. Next slide, please. We are interested to know if you've previously applied for SCA grant funding, so we've got another poll for you. In the right-hand column, please click on yes or no. This poll will close after about 15 seconds. So please answer, have you previously applied for an SCA grant? We'll just give it one more second. If everyone on the line could please click yes or no on the right side of your screen to indicate whether you have previously applied for an SCA grant. All right, it looks like the majority of folks who responded have said no. Just a small handful have said yes. Well, we're excited that you're joining us. We find that many of our applicants are at times previous SCA grantees. We encourage prior grantees and prior applicants to apply again, and we also love to see new grantees and learn about what's happening in your jurisdiction. So we're excited to have you here today. Next slide, please. If you apply for this grant, and if you're accepted, you'll join a large group of agencies throughout the country dedicated to improving supervision services in their communities. Through fiscal year 2018, BJA has issued 49 awards and over $30 million in funding to 17 counties, 28 states, and 4 city grantees. Next slide, please. Now we'll dive into the specifics of this Innovations in Supervision Initiative funding opportunity. As we go along, please remember to write down or submit any questions that you have. Next slide, please. The goal of the fiscal year 2019 Innovations in Supervision Initiative is to improve the capacity and effectiveness of probation and parole agencies to increase probation and parole success rates and reduce the rate of recidivism for those under supervision. Now, we pursue this because such efforts would arguably reduce crime, reduce admissions to prison and jails, and save taxpayer dollars. With this in mind, BJA will be looking for applicants that demonstrate ability to increase or implement the following objectives: reduce recidivism and violent crime in particular, develop, implement, and test innovative tools to predict violent recidivism and or share information with criminal justice partners, such as law enforcement or prosecutors, or others. Assess and document the process and outcomes of implementing recidivism and violent crime reduction strategies to serve as models for other agencies throughout the nation. Promote and increase collaboration among agencies and officials. Support capacity building activities and align agency practices with best and evidence-based practices. Next slide, please. In order to meet those objectives, applicants may propose a wide range of strategies and activities. Capacity building can be accomplished in many ways. Before I dig into the examples on this slide, I just want to make a quick distinction. The ISI grant is generally not used as a demonstration grant. This grant is not intended to help agencies stand up a particular program and serve X number of people, or at least not to only do that. Building capacity looks a little bit different. Grantees in this program generally pursue training or direct service improvements. So, for example, we've had ISI grantees develop a new caseload to supervise a particular type of case, such as sex offenses or young adults aged 18 to 24. I mention this in particular because to us, that's different from a pilot or demonstration project, because it is developing the capacity of particular agencies and supervision agents therein to work with a specific population and to develop the policies and protocols and services that go along with doing so. And that will live on, that investment in the capacity will live on beyond the life of the grant. Now, I also mentioned training. Other grantees primarily use this as a training objective, and we've seen that to be geared towards an entire agency, for example, in core correctional practices, or towards specific officers within an agency. This slide covers a few examples of work we've seen grantees undertake. Staff training can meet the rehabilitative and supervision needs of the population. This often includes case planning and how to go from a risk and need assessment results into a case plan. We've seen a gap analysis comparing the needs of the population and the services available to meet those needs, and then developing relationships with service providers in the community to address those gaps or to address quality issues with existing services. We've also seen agencies establish policies to ensure consistency in the way that practices are applied throughout their jurisdiction. And the last example on here is performance metrics. We've seen grantees develop and implement performance metrics so that the agency can understand what is working and how it's working and hold not only their supervision population but their staff accountable. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate, any strategies and activities proposed by applicants to this solicitation should be in pursuit of these two program goals. 1, to increase success rates among probation and parole agencies, and 2, to reduce the number of crimes being committed by those on supervision. The examples I discussed on the last slide are not at all meant to be limiting. You should propose what your agency needs that is supported by research. It can be innovative, but there's something out there in the research that suggests it will be successful. And I also want to mention that ISI is part of BJA's Innovations in Public Safety portfolio, also known as the Innovation Suite, which emphasizes evaluation to inform the field. As you'll hear in a few moments, an evaluation is a required part of this solicitation. We like to think of this grant program as research and development, or R&D, for the field of supervision. Next slide, please. BJA is looking to award up to 5 grantees $1 million over a 48-month grant period. That 48-month period begins at award announcement, which is anticipated to be on October 1, and upon budget approval, $200,000 will be available for use during a planning phase. Next slide. This slide shows you that the first section is the planning phase. The second one is implementation, and the third one is analysis and research. During the grant period, every grantee will be responsible for 3 major deliverables in addition to the quarterly performance measurement tool. During the planning period, grantees will develop an action plan by working through a guide together with their TA provider. This guide will help each grantee to develop a thorough and detailed work plan. Once that plan is approved by BJA, the remaining grant funds will be released. So again, to reiterate, it's an up to $1 million grant. Upon award, $200,000 will be available to support the planning period. After the planning period, once this action guide, this detailed work plan, has been submitted and approved by BJA, the remainder of the funds will be released for your use through an implementation and analysis and research period. Grantees will move into implementation, where you'll dive into the activities laid out during planning. And also during implementation, a midterm analysis and research report will be due at the 30-month mark. The last year of the award period is reserved for evaluation, and as you apply and put together your budgets, please note that funds should only be used to support evaluation activities in that final year, rather than to continue training or other project activities. And the reason for this is that, as we've learned over the last few years with this grant, in order to have time to evaluate the impact and the effect of your activities and strategies on your target population or on your staff, depending on exactly what you're doing, we need to allow a tail to follow people, to allow them to realize that impact and allow your researchers or yourselves to capture that. And so that's why we've built in, if you have seen this grant in years past, it's been 2 or 3 years, we're now going to 4, because we wanted to build in that tail for evaluation. And the final evaluation report will be due at grant closeout. I'm going to hand things back to Olivia now, but I will stay on the line to answer any BJA-directed questions at the end of the webinar. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Heather. And again, please continue to submit your questions. I know that was a lot of information, and we definitely want to make sure we answer any questions that you have. We will now move into some helpful tips in submitting your application and what you should expect. BJA has hosted a series of webinars to assist applications with applying for federal awards. This is a great resource for topics such as funding opportunities for your community in 2019, the first step to applying, what applicants should consider, and avoiding common mistakes. I strongly encourage you all to watch these webinars as you begin preparing your application. As you prepare to apply, make sure that you read the application and requirements. Develop a checklist. Think of steps that you need to do first, steps that will take the most time, and be sure you understand the criteria of the application. Start working on requesting letters of support or begin engaging partners to discuss their potential involvement, and start drafting an outline of the narrative. You also want to pay attention to what is being asked and be sure you answer every question. A helpful tip when organizing your narrative: tables can be single-spaced that are not part of the components of the program narrative. Starting early as possible is probably the most important advice we can give all applicants. It can sometimes take up to 14 days just to complete the registration process. And other common mistakes are changing the order of the structure of the review criteria when developing the program narrative, exceeding stated page limitations, and not adhering to the format of the guidelines. So please, make sure you read and reread the requirements of the application. And register now if you're able to. Your program narrative is where you'll have 15 pages, double-spaced, to address the area on this slide, excluding the budget. This is your opportunity to tell your story based upon data about the need for addressing the reentry and supervision issues in your jurisdiction, and to demonstrate that you have the ability to take on each of the tasks outlined in the program requirement. Be as detailed as possible. Remember, this is where you want to be clear and detailed in explaining your program design. Priority considerations will be given to applicants who propose strategies to reduce violent recidivism among high-risk offenders, collaborate with justice partners, and employ randomized controlled trial RCT methods to evaluate effectiveness. All applicants will be judged on the totality of their proposal. In order to receive priority consideration, applicants must demonstrate they satisfy the criteria defined in this section, in addition to all selection criteria defined throughout the solicitation. Please refer to page 7 of the solicitation for further guidance on priority consideration. As Heather mentioned earlier, this year's project's timeline is for 48 months, which is an additional year than previous ISI grants. During the 48 months, 6 months will be used for planning phase. During your planning phase, you will be required to develop an action plan or a P&I guide. In this action plan, you will be required to submit to BJA for approval prior to beginning the implementation phase. Implementation will be for 30 months, where a midterm report will be due at the end of the 30 months. The final 12 months of the grant period will be for evaluation activities, and your final analysis and research report will be due at the end of 48 months. Also, as noted earlier, during the planning phase, you will be allotted $200,000 for planning fund activities only. Once your action plan has been approved, the remainder funds will be available for implementation. And during the final 12 months of your grant period, funds can only be used to support evaluation activities. This brings me to the keys to success. We have seen grantees develop grant programs and plans, however, fail to take into account the timeline of developing these programs. Take the time to develop a realistic plan and timeline, and include input from your key partners. Begin collaborating with stakeholders and research partners early. Secure their commitment to the project. Begin discussing data collection plans and methods. These things take time, so start as early as possible. When drafting the budget, make sure you carefully read and understand any caps on expenses or unallowable expenses. Clearly state the purpose of each expense. Utilize the DOJ Grant Financial Guide for assistance. There is a combined budget and budget narrative template that you can use that is linked to solicitation. Within the budget detail worksheet, there's a sample worksheet that has been included as a resource. Refer to the tab labeled Example Budget Detail Worksheet. When you're ready to submit, ensure that you have triple-checked that each item has been addressed and attached to the application for a strong and complete application. We recommend utilizing Appendix B, application checklist, located at the end of the solicitation to ensure all required items are completed and attached. Again, you will want to register through grant.gov prior to submitting your application. Once this is complete, applications can be submitted through grant.gov no later than June 25th, 2019 at 11:59 p.m. Now that we have talked through expectations and how to prepare for submitting your applications, let's hear about some direct experience. I would like to introduce Dr. Nancy Andilora, who is the Director of Research of the New York City Department of Probation. She will now provide a brief overview of their project and their processes and challenges of submitting their application.
Hello, everyone. Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here to talk about my agency's experience and to answer any questions you may have. First off, a brief overview of the project. So first, the problem. where the focus was on our 16 to 24-year-old population. Based on the disproportionality of the 16 to 24-year-old population compared to their rearrests, right? So they make up about 25 to 30% of our population and made up about 40 to 50% of the rearrests annually. So that was our problem to tackle. Our proposed solution was to develop a new model of supervising these youth, 16 to 24-year-olds, who are moderate and high risk based on our risk assessment instrument, and to utilize evidence-based practices, including theories involving positive youth development, a strengths-based approach, adolescent brain development, and using new CBT tools and programming around that. And also just focusing on the relationship, right, developing more positive relationships while supervising these youth on probation. And the proposal included a process and outcome evaluation. The process evaluation has been completed and submitted, so we're now currently working and focusing on the outcome evaluation report. So to go into the preparation, how we prepared to submit, a brief note that I'm thinking about this or talking about this application process now with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, right? After having been in the implementation mode for several years now, we can look back and view this process through the lens of how did what we draft actually pan out when we tried to do the work we claimed we wanted to do, right? So we wish we'd been looking through this lens as we drafted the application. It's probably almost impossible to do so, but I hope that this is helpful for all of you as I discuss this now. So in preparation to submit, first, what's important is obviously identifying evaluation partners, right? First is, critical to us was thinking about an evaluator that could be a thought partner when we were talking about putting together this application. So Debbie Ketzel from John Jay College of Criminal Justice, she was happy to partner with us on this evaluation. And this is before my time, but there was a history of partnership with Debbie in the past, Dr. Ketzel in the past, and this was a natural evolution to our partnership with her and her experience as an evaluator. Our second partner was with the, in developing the positive youth development lens, right? This cultural shift in supervising adults on probation is really important and critical that we identified a technical assistance partner that really understood this, and we found that in our partners at YDI, Youth Development Institute, and it's really important to get their feedback on early drafts of the application in terms of timeline, when they would, best be introduced and involved in the training of the staff that would be part of this new program. And also the third thing that I really think is more important than I think we didn't put as much importance on this, and we should have started a little earlier, admittedly, is creating an internal review team or a feedback team made up of multiple functional areas in our agency, right? The operations group, quality assurance, and our training division combined to talk about the feasibility from an implementation perspective, how well or how can we implement this in a timely way and, sort of streamline into current practices. And, it was really relevant to get colleagues to provide the necessary information. What were our capabilities? What were our competencies, right? And there were many people on the staff and on this team that were part of past federal grants and kind of understood, how it would work with this one as well. That their feedback was super important. And also just things that seem to be small but take time, right? In how we prepared for this application. I wasn't a part of this my colleague, Lily Shapiro, probably could have spoken better if she were here. She couldn't make it today, but starting early on collecting letters of support, she found was super important. Not only in getting the affirmative in providing the letters, but, working, iteratively to get those letters in a timely way before that deadline was important. So I identified the biggest challenge we identified in putting together the application is really about aligning all things, right? Aligning the narrative, what we actually propose, the budget, and the timeline. Because frankly, we wound up having to file a few grant adjustment notices, which, is not uncommon to do. But if we had thought about how we could have streamlined, the timeline better. And this goes back to bringing in that team, that feedback, review team from our, internally from our, relative divisions. If we had brought them in earlier, we could have thought about the timeline a little bit better and thought about, how it could have been more flexible or what really worked out. In the end, looking back, obviously, 2020 hindsight, it makes sense now to us what didn't work, but would have been helpful early on to talk to those partners. So what we would have done differently, first, as has been said, definitely save more time for submitting the application via GMS. That is super critical, and we didn't realize how much time it would take. In fact, we in submitting, we did come across one obstacle. We actually had to call the customer service number for help. They were fantastic, very helpful, but it ended up taking double, triple the time than we really thought it would have taken to submit. So don't think about submitting until the last hour of the deadline. So there were definitely unanticipated pieces not mentioned in the solicitation as well that we just didn't think about. I think it was something about congressional districts. I'm not really sure. It was a while ago now, but I remember thinking about certain pieces of the details not related to our project or the proposal itself that we needed questions to be answered. Also, as I said, what we would have done differently, we would have crafted the timeline differently to give ourselves more flexibility to account for really just real life implementation issues. We came across these snafus that, turnover being one of them, turnover of staff that definitely pushed back our timeline, longer than we would have expected or anticipated. So definitely allow for those kinds of things when thinking about the timeline. And third is really about the data, which is really important for the evaluation piece and definitely my strength and what I was part of the most for this evaluation. We could have thought through more comprehensively about what we could do with the data and more realistically, right? Determining realistically what kind of data elements that we could have realistically collected in the timeline allotted to us by this grant. And one obstacle for us, a personal sort of individual issue for us was we had just very recently switched to a new case management system. So when we were writing this proposal, there was a lot that was unknown about our system and what we could actually collect in the long run for the project itself, for the evaluation. So I suppose one piece of advice is know your case management system. Don't, switch to a new case management system as you're, starting a project like this. And really be, or, if it happens to be your evaluation partner is the primary, person or an entity that is dealing with the data collection, make sure that they understand and know the data really well and know what kinds of data that can be collected. And also either, the agency or evaluator understands that there may be data that are needed that are external to the primary source. So like for us, we had to tap into our state system and actually do a formal request of data from the state to get certain recidivism data points for the outcome evaluation. And so making sure that that's understood and the process that it takes, the time that it takes to get that information is super important. Yeah, so really, you know, despite everything and despite the snafus we've come across throughout the process, really we're on track now after submitting, I think, 2 grant adjustment notices. We are on track with our current timeline. As I said, we completed the process evaluation on time. BJA has been really responsive to our questions. CSG has been really such a helpful TA provider in navigating this entire process as well. So I wanted to shout out there as well that they've been very helpful. And yeah, that's all here.
Thank you, Dr. Andy Laura. That was great. I definitely appreciate you taking the time to come and share your experience with everyone.
No problem.
All right, so we will now move into the question and answer portion of this webinar. Please continue to ask your questions down in the Q&A panel located at the bottom of your screen, and we will be sure to answer as many as we can. All right, we have a question here. Heather, this one's for you. Are public institutions of higher education, which are defined as units of state government, eligible to apply for this grant?
That is a great question. So it's a yes, but kind of a no. And I want to explain because I want to make sure everyone walks away with a clear answer, so bear with me. By definition, if you are defined as a unit of state government, you are meeting one eligibility criteria. However, we typically are not able to make these awards because whoever receives the funding must have the authority over or responsibility for the target population so that we can have confidence that you'll be able to deliver the services or the activities or complete everything that is proposed. So I understand, yes, you meet that definition technically, but the answer would be no. What I would recommend, though, is to partner with your state or local supervision agency. We see that frequently. It makes for a very competitive application. And as you heard me mention, there is an evaluation requirement. So you can certainly, we'd love to see institutions of higher learning serve that purpose, as well as any sort of strategic partnership that works for your jurisdiction. So I'd recommend that you come in as a sub-awardee with the jurisdiction as the primary applicant.
Thank you, Heather. This next question is for you as well. In regards to the $1 million that's for planning and implementation, the question in regards to, is that sufficient to run a program for 48 months?
No, it's not, and this money is not meant to run a program. I agree with you. But I think if you can go through that solicitation again with a critical eye when this webinar is posted, and I think a lot of this stuff, we're delivering it in a way that we think is straightforward, but I know it's complicated. And so I know I've made reference, and you've heard Olivia make reference to the purpose and the types of activities, and this particular grant is not designed to help someone stand up and run a program. Instead, it is designed to be an investment in supervision agencies to help you achieve your goals. And that may be training, that may be development or procurement of a tool, but it isn't to stand up a program.
Thank you, Heather. And a follow-up for the first question you asked, the question was, so if we partner with a community-based correctional facility, would they be the lead applicant? And from my understanding, Heather, from your answer, that would be yes. You can partner with the lead agency and provide the evaluation portion of that program. Is that correct?
Absolutely. We'd love to see that.
Thank you. Another question we have here, can a shorter implementation period be used?
It certainly can. I think it really depends on what you're proposing to do. So the answer is yes, it can be. I would recommend, just because we have the 4-year period of performance, I would recommend that everybody go for it. Of course, I'm saying that not knowing what you would propose. So if it's something that is like a training initiative that is can be easily rolled out within a year and then evaluate the impacts of it the next year, maybe that's what's best for you. But generally, things take longer to get off the ground than we think they're going to. And that happens because of turnover in agencies or just delays that happen. So yes, it can be shorter, but I don't know that I would propose a shorter period. You might front load some activities, but I would take the time. And again, that's a recommendation. That is not a requirement.
All right, we have another question here. Is this grant for adults only or juvenile and adults?
So this particular grant is for adults only. BJA generally funds programs for the adult side of the criminal justice system, and our sister agency, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, receives appropriations and is authorized to make grants for juveniles. Now, if there are juveniles who are sentenced or being otherwise treated by systems as adults, they are absolutely allowed to be participants in anything funded through this program. In fact, we have seen, as I think I mentioned earlier, a particular project where a grantee was developing a supervision caseload for young adults. So it happens, but this should not be a proposal to target a juvenile population.
Thank you. Next question. On page 31 of the solicitation, it indicates a section on sustainability, but it's not noted earlier in the solicitation. So should this section be included?
Yes. So a nod to sustainability should be included. And this goes back, I think, to the earlier point in some ways about standing up a program or how this money should be used. This program is designed to improve the capacity or expand the capacity of the supervision agency. And the vision for that is not a one and done. So for example, I'll continue with the example of a special caseload. If someone is writing an application and proposing that funding be used to hire, train, and provide management to officers on a particular caseload, the application should also go a step further to say how the agency or the jurisdiction will continue to support that work once the grant funding is gone. And that's why things like training initiatives or the adoption of a tool are often really strong applications, because those are things where the uptake, the initial thing, is the larger investment. I do want to say, though, this is not to say that you should not be providing direct services to to supervisees using this funding. It is absolutely allowed. We award it every year, and we're happy to do that. But those applications are the tougher ones to make the argument of how you'll be able to sustain them. What we don't want to do is say, for example, that grant funds will be used to deliver behavioral health services, let's say, to a target population of adults in 3 communities over a period of 3 years. And that's the sole purpose of the grant. Because then when that funding ends, the impact of it sort of goes away. On the other hand, a more competitive application would be, as we said, like a gap analysis to assess the needs of a population, figure out what services you have and how the existing ones are or are not meeting the population's needs, develop relationships with service providers to address the unmet needs, and then evaluate the effectiveness of those services so that you can bring those who are underperforming up to par, or perhaps decide to move to something like performance-based contracting. And in the course of that, grant funding can be used to deliver services because you're building a larger capability or capacity within the agency.
Thank you. Next question is in regards to page 24 of the solicitation, with the attachment requiring research and evaluation independence and integrity. If grant funds are not being used for evaluation, is that still necessary?
If grant funds are not being used for the evaluation, then we need to see how the evaluation is otherwise being paid for, because an evaluation is a requirement of this grant, and therefore that independence and integrity attachment is necessary.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. If you do not use the entire $200,000 for planning, does that carry over to the next phase?
It absolutely does.
Thank you. Will there be additional webinars? I can speak on that in regards to the solicitation webinar. This will be recorded for your view in the future, and we do another webinar in regards to once you've received the award and the orientation process. Heather, did you want to add to that?
Nope, I think that was great. Thank you.
We have a few more minutes for any additional questions, if anybody has any.
As we're waiting a moment for additional questions to roll in, I just want to put a flag out there. As I said, Innovations in Supervision is just one of many grant programs funded through the Second Chance Act. There's the Innovative Reentry Initiative program, which I believe there's a webinar just after this one today for folks who are interested in applying to that one. And that is not supervision focused, but is instead focused on the target population of individuals returning from incarceration to communities. There's also a community-based reentry solicitation, and that one, I apologize, I don't know off the top of my head when that webinar, if it took place already or when it is, but that one is the grant opportunity for nonprofits or faith-based institutions, anyone who's not strictly government or who has authority over these populations. That's the go-to grant for those groups.
Thank you, Heather. And here is a slide of resources that has additional information in regards to writing application and just additional resources, as we mentioned throughout this webinar. Very useful as you begin to prepare your application. So again, this will be recorded and available for you to have as your resource. And here is the contact information if you have any additional questions about submitting your application or any issues with registration. Feel free to contact grant.gov. You have their hotline here as well as their online web support. They're very helpful, as you heard from Dr. Andy Laura. They've been very useful and will be able to assist you in your needs regarding the grant application. I do want to thank everybody for joining us on this webinar today. This concludes the webinar, and I'd like to give another special thanks to Heather and Dr. Andy Laura for joining us on this presentation. Again, this webinar will be posted on the NRRC website, so be sure to subscribe to our newsletter to get that announcement. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.